Hello, everyone. I thought we'd get started right now. I wanted to welcome you to World Affairs and our panel on Iran and the United States. My name is Philip Young. I'm the new CEO of World Affairs and wanted to welcome you here. I hope that you and your loved ones are all safe and staying healthy. We here in San Francisco are sheltering in for, I guess it's the 7th week. And as a result of this, we've had to pivot very hard like everyone else has. We usually do many live programs, but as a result, we are now doing these remote programs, which have turned out quite well. We're so glad that so many of you have agreed to attend and be part of this. And so why don't we just get started? My job is really easy, just to do some quick introductions and get out of the way as quickly as possible. I can't tell you how pleased we are to host a conversation with this very distinguished panel. We have here Frank Wisner, Ambassador Frank Wisner. I'm not going to go through his very distinguished career. Let's suffice it to say, he's been a 4-time ambassador. His career spans 4 decades and 8 American presidents. We also have Dr. Roxane Farmanfarmaian. She is the Director of International Studies at the Global Politics at the University of Cambridge for continuing education. And she's a senior research fellow at the King's College. And then finally, to be your moderator is the very capable Barbara Slavin, who I've known for quite some time. She is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a former journalist, and an Iran expert in her own right. So with that, Barbara, why don't I turn it over to you? Thank you all again for being part of this program, and we look forward to doing this with you all sometime again soon.
Well, thank you very much. Generous introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting this event. We have a lot to talk about. I know that COVID is on everyone's mind, but of course there have been other things going on. The US and Iran have come perilously close to really major hostilities in the last few months. And we have a still rather dicey situation in Iraq and other places. We're going to start by giving each of our distinguished speakers about 10 minutes to discuss the issue from their area of expertise. We're going to start with Dr. Farmanfarmaian, who's going to talk about the COVID situation in Iran. I believe something like 6,000 deaths reported, although many people believe the number is much higher. And I saw that President Hassan Rouhani just today announced that they were basically reopening for business because of the economic situation, that they simply could not afford to hunker down any longer. So please tell us what you see, talk about the impact of sanctions and US policy on the situation.
Well, it was a difficult year leading up to the arrival of COVID. And in fact, the week before the first cases were announced, Rouhani had stated to the parliament that for the very first time, the economy had actually repurposed itself and was no longer dependent on oil exports. And this was a first for an oil producing country. So that certainly was a difficult, that was good news. But then a week later, the COVID hit, and it was both an economic and a health issue, and very much, I think, the way that Iran had repurposed its economy, it was very much involved with self-production. It was doing manufacturing in pharmaceuticals and steel, and producing a lot of internal consumption products. And one kitchen appliance factory owner said to me, the economy has boomed while I've been able to, really capitalize on this. I'm making everything for kitchens, and just importing just a few little bits from China. But as it turned out, those few little bits turned out to have an outsized role in how Iran then went forth to contain the virus. So the reason was that once the maximum sanctions from Washington hit, China played a huge role. And so the response of Iran was to keep the relationship with China going probably just too long, because to cut it would have really affected its economy. And we're also seeing that the coronavirus has helped focus minds inside Iran about how its government actually has processed all of this. Today, we're seeing that the general population feels that the biggest problem with the government is corruption and mismanagement, but they generally feel, and by the way, that's something every government in Iran has suffered. And, but they generally feel that its testing program, it's gotten on top of the virus, and that generally, particularly those in rural areas and provinces, feel it's done a pretty good job, and that it's overall performing pretty well. And in fact, 2 out of 3 Iranians polled don't feel that a foundational change should take place in their government today. So this is quite different than often what is portrayed in the States, where it's viewed as an extremely fragile government that could, with just a little shove, be toppled over. It's been around for 40 years. It has dealt with wars and crises and sanctions, and it's still with us. And the Iranian government also runs a very significant economy. It's huge. And so these are elements that I think make Iranians feel as though they can be resilient. That's one of the words they use. But obviously they fear that what might be coming down the pike from the United States, in fact, may be even worse than regime change. They don't even know if the US government feels strongly enough to worry about regime change. They're worried about it will just let the regime collapse and let the Iranian people pick up the pieces. So I think that to wrap up, the greatest hope is that Trump has always said he doesn't want to go into another war. He certainly showed in the last several months that he's not willing to go to war with Iran over Saudi Arabia after supposedly Iran's missiles hit Saudi Arabia and a major oil production area of Saudi Arabia. But I do think they're concerned that if their own government perhaps pushes it too hard, and all of this provocation, for example, in the Gulf would possibly play into that. Although, if I can take 1 second to explain that from the Iranian perspective, it's not just to be annoying. Basically, every single gallon of gas at the pump includes a security cost, and that security cost is the price of the Navy accompanying tankers out of the Strait of Hormuz and beyond. And so they're in the business of ensuring that security cost remains, especially now that the price of oil has dropped and can't even cover the cost of production. So
if you don't mind, we have limited time.
No, absolutely. Sorry. Okay.
I have lots more questions for you about the internal situation, but let me first tell the viewers, the participants, that if they look at the bottom of their screen, there's a little button that says Q&A. And if you have questions for the speakers, I encourage you to start typing in those questions in the Q&A box. I will see them, and then I'll be able to direct them to the speakers for as long as we have the time to do it. But I want to turn to Ambassador Wisner, who knows this region extremely well, and ask him to talk a bit more about U.S. policy toward Iran, how he sees it. Do you anticipate any changes, any shifts in Trump administration policy before our elections, or are we pretty much stuck with maximum pressure until our presidential elections?
Well, first of all, let me thank the World Affairs Council and you, Barbara, an old friend, Dr. Roxane. A real privilege to appear with the two of you on this extremely important subject, one that has been at the center of American foreign policy during 7 presidencies now, and promises to dog the footsteps of whoever we elect in November. A really awful, long, protracted dispute between ourselves and the Islamic Republic, with huge loss of life of Americans who've died, Iranians, others in the region. And today we find ourselves, as Barbara very rightly pointed out, sitting on a powder keg with forces arraigned on both sides rhetoric hot and the possibility of a flare-up occurring literally at any moment by miscalculation more than I believe by calculation. For I'm convinced that the leadership in Tehran, and certainly not Washington, wants a war. However, having brought the situation to the place that we're at today, with the United States pursuing explicitly a policy of forcing Iran to change its strategy in the Middle East, withdraw its footprint, remove, to back away from any nuclear capability, to almost change its internal structures, or in the minds of some, literally regime change. And the Iranians on their side arraigned behind a maximum resistance to that American pressure. We find ourselves, therefore, with two polar opposites and very little flexibility, very little prospect of standing away. Now, as I look at the history, it's a long one. Unfortunately, I'm not going to try to rehash it. But if I start at the salient point in the present circumstances, 2015. 2015, this long period of hostility, the United States, Iran, and the nations that comprise the Security Council in Germany came to an agreement. This agreement, the JCPOA, the joint agreement to stand down the Iranian nuclear program, was a historic one, for it brought the international community and Iran together on two things. The first, that the most dangerous and threatening aspect of Iran's process of confrontation and securing itself, its nuclear capability, that would be put on hold and would recede as a threat. Second, there was a promise implicit, a promise that was never fulfilled on our side, on theirs, and that was that you could leave, the nuclear agreement would be the floor, not the ceiling, and that you could go on and begin to talk about the other issues that vex the region. Iran's presence in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, the threats Gulf nations feel, Israel feels, these issues and missile developments could all be eventually addressed. Unfortunately, with our last election, the United States changed course. And Trump tore up the JCPOA, walked away from it, and in doing so, brought to bear on Iran the full scope of American sanctions, but not just American sanctions. America put itself in the position where it would sanction other nations that did business with Iran, thereby frightening off the kinds of commercial exchanges that Dr. Roxane mentioned. The United States at the same time increased its troop presence in the region. The United States escalated its rhetoric, moved to block Iran even most recently in achieving access to funding from the IMF. The string of American actions to put pressure on Iran has been unrelenting. And on the Iranian side, the Iranians have been determined for cause of national honor and national security to push back with maximum resistance. And we've seen the results of that policy of maximum resistance, tanker attacks in the Gulf. We've seen the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities. We've seen the attacks on American bases in Iraq. We've seen a heightened set of tensions that continue literally until today. And so we have to, I think, stand back from this extraordinarily dangerous situation in which calculation or miscalculation could lead us both to a war that neither of us want and realize the consequences will be overwhelming. And I think we as Americans need to ask ourselves, has our pressure over these last 4 years, nearly 4 years, accomplished the objectives that we thought we were trying to achieve. Is the regime in Iran stronger today or weaker? And Dr. Roxane, I think you answered that very satisfactorily. Has Iran pulled back from Iraq or Syria or its commitments in Lebanon? Is its footprint in the region lighter than it was 4 years ago? Certainly not. Third, does Iran's desire to maintain a robust military forward-reaching defense in the form of missiles, does Iran have fewer or more missile capability today? Has Iran's nuclear capability, if you compare it to the time of the JCPOA and today, is it more or it's less? I think we know the answer to literally all of those questions. But also important for the United States, have we actually increased our ability to mobilize an international community, our alliances, Russia and China, to help deal with Iran, or are we estranged from our own closest allies and others who deal with? And I think we have to admit that we are. So if you take and pause for a moment and say, if policy, the purpose of policy is to achieve objectives that redound to the national interest, you can't look at the last several years with Iran and say this policy is accepted. And so I'm prepared today to argue we're at a time in our lives where we have to really seriously think about a change, and I will precisely call for just such a change. I do not believe, Barbara, that one will occur in the remaining months of this administration. It is wedded to the practices of the past several years, as recent days have indicated. Is there a chance we could see something different if there was a different outcome with the election? That remains to be seen. But I suggest that we have to be very careful when we look forward. We have to be careful for a number of reasons. First, we have to get out of this period of intense confrontation. That I can imagine. But second, we have to face the fact, and Dr. Roxane, you pointed to it, and that is that Iran does not trust the United States. And you can't create an international agreement, you can't create a lessening of tension in an absence of any form of serious trust. The government in Iran is shifting to the right. Its positions are hardening. The government of Iran, the Iranians are determined to resist us, and that means they will be taking chances, pushing back against the United States, occasionally taking nearly reckless chances that could lead to violence. So the path to the future is strewn with many rocks. And so is there a path? I think there is. There is a path for diplomacy, but it has to start with an assumption that we want to bring tensions down in the region, and going at the Iran-US relationship is core to it. Number one, we would have to take a second look at our nuclear agreement. I do not believe, I think Barbara's absolutely right, that Iran will go back to a nuclear agreement as it was negotiated in 2016. There is going to have to be a very different look. I wouldn't aim with a new administration, a Biden administration, if that that's the outcome of the election, I wouldn't go to the nuclear question first of all. I believe we need to look at where we in Iran have immediate pressing national interests that have to be resolved. Iraq is one, very important, because there we are tightly lined up in a very dangerous set of circumstances with Iranian proxies on the field. Afghanistan is another where the United States is trying to leave, and we in Iran have common interest in the survival of a non-Taliban Iran. Those two areas offer some points of accommodation. Iran wants a stable Iraq, a stable neighbor in Iraq. Iran wants a stable Afghanistan, and both of these objectives are reasonable to us. So I argue those two. But I think a policy, and we need a strategy if we're going to have a policy. We need a strategy that ends at some point. And my mind goes back to my own experience in the Cold War, that we in Russia finally came to a way of structuring our competition around the Helsinki Agreement, a time in which we in Russia agreed that what was important to Russia would be taken into account, what was important to the West would be taken into account. And we came up with a formula of talking about our differences so that we avoided getting into conflict. I can see a Helsinki type arrangement one day in the Gulf. And I believe the parties of that would be the Gulf nations, would be Iran, be ourselves, the permanent members of the Security Council. But you need an objective, and I argue that an objective like that would give us a chance to secure on an ongoing basis the region, not produce peace, but would manage the enormous tensions that are inherent in that part of the world.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask each of you a follow-up question. Yeah, maybe if you could, the sound is okay, good, all right. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and I have also a personal one for you, Dr. Roxane. This is from someone who lived in Tehran in the early 1960s and attended the Tehran American School. I don't know if you can see the question, but this person knew a Tanya and Junie Farmanfarmaian and wonders if you're related to them. So if you could answer that. But my other question for you is about the political situation in Iran. And I mean, we should also mention how repressive the society has become, that there have been protests because of the economic situation that have been crushed with rather extreme brutality, which may be one reason why people are reluctant to come out. We've not seen any cracks in the security services in Iran. And in fact, we have seen the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps become stronger even after some rather extraordinary blunders, such as the accidental shooting down of a Ukrainian civilian airliner in the midst of hostilities with the US. So my question for you is, could Iran return to negotiations, say with the Biden administration? President Rouhani and others around him have said that all the steps they've taken out of the nuclear deal are reversible, that they can come back into compliance if the United States comes back into compliance. Or are we once again going to be in a situation like we were with Rouhani's predecessor, Ahmadinejad, where the US and Iran are out of sync, that when we're ready to talk, they're not ready? This has been something we've seen often over the last 40 years. So let me start on that with you, and then I'll have one for Ambassador Wisner.
I'll try to keep it short. Yes, I'm a cousin of Tanya and Junie's. Big family. The political situation has been tense primarily for two reasons. One, because economics puts a great deal of pressure on people. And so we see that the protests in November, also in 2018, not to put a bonny gloss on it, but these were protests. They were people that were going out and protesting because of economic hardship. And they were not demonstrations. They have not been, uprisings. They were protests. And the crackdown in November, I think, speaks to the other point that I wanted to make. And that is, there is a great deal of talk anyway, that the United States is supporting other countries and other groups to come in and threaten Iran. And that rhetoric had reached a point just as these protests were erupting, where Iran felt that some of the streets and its arms on the streets were being contributed to by outside groups, which made it particularly skittish. Now, it is a heavy-handed regime. We know this, and it does not shirk from showing when push comes to shove that it will exercise that. We saw that at the Green Movement, much less the first demonstrations that came out in 2018, where people were upset with the distribution of currency. But it has that element strongly. So people are wary of it, but I think there is a sense that they can come out if they have grievances. Just to quickly address this aspect, though, that you point to a little bit about the militarization, the fact that we're seeing a great deal more of that elite group, which is now so big that it's probably not really elite anymore, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. We're seeing that because they have infiltrated themselves and very frontally into all sorts of other parts of the economy and the politics, so that they are part of the industrial, military complex. But I do want to add one further thing that has been brought up by really astute economists that watch this space, and that is that they have risen over the last 15 years, but so has another group, and that is the privatization and private enterprise area of Iran. And in fact, that group has been the drivers of this turnaround. And so what we need to look at, particularly since you are right, Barbara, it will be primarily conservatives and hardliners that will take the political stage after the moderates have been damaged by all of this. Where does the integration between private enterprise and the Revolutionary Guard and the conservatives overlap? And I think any plan for the United States to actually grapple with and take that on has got to look at those players who are going to be the major interlocutors on every stage with the outer world.
Yeah, that is a really excellent point. And Iran also has an incredible high-tech sector, which was really about to take off with the JCPOA, and unfortunately is experiencing a lot of difficulties now. So I think we should realize that there's still constituencies in the country that we can appeal to. Ambassador Wisner, I want to go back to you. There was a question earlier, I think you touched on it to some extent, but it was a question about Iran's support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. I think you made the point that we have not seen any real diminution in support, certainly for groups like Hezbollah, despite the maximum pressure campaign. But you might say a word about where you see that going forward. And also, if you could talk about the latest gambit of the Trump administration, which is now calling for an arms embargo. This is an embargo on conventional arms transfers to Iran that under the JCPOA is supposed to expire in October. And Secretary of State Pompeo has now said, no, it can't expire. And the United States, even though we left the JCPOA, is still somehow entitled to go to the UN Security Council and demand that it extend this arms embargo on Iran. So if you could perhaps deal with those two.
Let me begin by also congratulating Dr. Roxane on the last point she made about the regime itself. This is not a regime that any American would want to live under. But that's not the point. And I think you've made it very clear. The United States, to survive and pursue its interests in the world, has got to deal with reality. We don't get to choose who's on the other side of the table. And the question that you put your finger on is who's on the other side of the table and are they going to leave? And I think you've made the point very clearly that by popular acceptance, by regime control, the Islamic Republic is there, it's going to be around, and if we want to see a greater level of peace and security in the area, it is with them that we have to deal. We can't deal with our dreams, we have to deal with reality. Which therefore leads me to Barbara's point. You have to take a step back and try to figure out where the other side is. Why does Hezbollah receive Iranian support and other proxy forces? What's the cause of Iran's presence in Iraq or in Syria? All of these which frustrate us, which threaten friends like our Arab allies in the Gulf, Israel and others, roil the region. Why does that exist? I think there you have to take into account Iran's own history, her sense of beleaguerment, her experience with war, the Iran-Iraq war, created a psychosis in Iran of siege, of vulnerability, of attack. And Iran has made it cardinal to its national security to reach out and have a region in which it has influence in order to secure itself. Now, absolute security for one party means insecurity for others. And that's why I come back to the notion you've got to achieve some balance in security on all sides. Hezbollah isn't going to go away in Iran. Bashar al-Assad isn't going to go away in Syria. Iran's going to be present in the region, but does it have to compromise the basic security of the Arab world, its sense of dignity? No. And there, I think, that's why I point to an outcome in which we have to get parties around the table to begin to sort out what's important and what isn't. Hezbollah is going to be a threat to Israel for years to come until there is a political stand down in the region. And that needs to be the core objective of American policy. You make a final point, Barbara, when you mention the recent initiative of the Secretary of State to argue that the United States may have left the JCPOA, but it didn't leave the Security Council resolution that accepted the JCPOA. And therefore, though we have imposed sanctions on Iran, we now want to pretend we're party to a UN understanding in order to apply yet more sanctions on Iran. The sophistry overwhelms me. But I believe that we've already heard from Lavrov and the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif. The Europeans are extremely uncomfortable with this American maneuver. I don't think it's going to go very far, but it's going to be a very hot subject of debate. But what's at the core? The core is an attempt on the part of the United States to deal with an aspect of the JCPOA that is truly vexing. When the JCPOA was achieved, we all thought we were beginning a period in which open commerce, open trade, investment, normalization of relations would have produced a different Iran and a different outside world. But our decision to break the JCPOA has led to this very fraught situation. And so now we end up in October with a problem on our hands. The JCPOA foresaw the return of Iran's right to import and export armament. And Lord knows that's no use to us or anyone else. The region has too many weapons as it is. So there's going to have to be another way to address the arms issue. But let's not forget why the issue is on the table today. It started with our decision to pull out of the JCPOA and leave Iran with few choices before it.
Thank you. I have two really excellent questions for Dr. Roxane. One is a question about whether cultural differences are playing a role in US-Iran relations, and a question about whether we can ever really have diplomatic relations with Iran, given the significant role that clerics play. And let me add to that also a question about the fallout from the current low oil prices on Iran. As you mentioned, Dr. Roxane, Iran had already reduced its dependence on oil because of sanctions. So is this providing any kind of additional cushion, or is Iran really in trouble with the price of oil as low as it is?
Well, let me take the first part, cultural differences. I think we've seen several periods during in the past where relations have been very good. And I'm so heartened to hear Ambassador Wisner put it in the terms that he does, because it shows that that kind of thinking and that ability to reach out means that whatever cultural differences there are, as long as one tries to understand the other person and understand that they're really there on the other side of the table, that a mechanism of communication can take place. And I've actually personally, I may get attacked for this, but I've always felt that the Iranians and the Americans share a great deal. Yeah. And that there could be a very positive set of relationships that are but the problem has been the depth of the distrust, and as long as that simply is added to, that is where really careful and tactical diplomacy needs to, and patience needs to be used in order to get over the initial rocky period. And that, I think, for those who felt that the JCPOA had reduced the nuclear threat and had actually brought greater stability to the area, I think that's the part that is most missed, because there was a sense that it continued. And in fact, even though it's on life support now, there's an element of it still playing a role of reducing the nuclear it deters the nuclear issue. And I think the United States is playing on that at the moment. So I think there is certainly a possibility of Iran-US relations. And the issue probably that is the greatest concern is how does one actually then get around a situation that is led by clerics, led by a religion that is very difficult to understand, and how is that translated politically? And I think it's been an interesting case where there's been this major debate between the Ministry of Health and the clerical establishment in Qom, the place where the virus actually began, whether to shut down the shrine in Qom. And first of all, that speaks to the fractured nature of the Iranian government, the Ministry of Health doing one thing, the clerics doing the other. But on the other hand, it also speaks to a deep cultural commitment to the practices and the rituals. And this is a virus that has destroyed the possibility of mourning across the world. And the ritual of mourning is very significant in Iran. So that it's tentative and the tensions are high about that. But in the past, we have seen actually that the clerics have been very pragmatic. They were pragmatic about a health program that brought in containment of HIV, which in a country that didn't even recognize, the manifest elements of that is fascinating. And so they can be extremely pragmatic as long as there is a national interest that's served and a benefit to the populace. And so I'll leave it there.
Well, let me just follow on that, because many observers, including many Iranians in the diaspora, they look at Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of the country, his comments and so on. And the argument always is that this regime cannot afford a relationship with the United States because they're so afraid that Iranians would be, so swept by the Americans returning that would be, in effect, what brings down the system, rather than some sort of more overt war. They talk about a soft war, about a velvet revolution, that kind of thing. Is there some basis to that argument that they're afraid, leadership is afraid of a relationship with the United States?
Well, I would argue, and I would give this also over to Ambassador Wisner, I would argue that there is a fear on both sides. They know each other so little at this point, and they've both been so willing to break rules and expectations. So I think there is a fear, but I think what it really comes down to is a lack of trust. They have hurt each other over and over again, and they know each other well. I think over time, the United States and Iran have come to be very, very good at knowing exactly what's going to really bother both the regime and incite the population. And so it is got to be tentative steps. The trust has to be established. I don't think the argument that a wave of Western culture and products into Iran is really what the cleric regime is worried about. I think we see that it's been surprisingly open to having women not be absolutely covered. In fact, it's become quite open and colorful. So there are indications all the way across that there are social ways to adapt to the clerical requirements. But I think it's the trust.
Yeah. We have time just really for one more. I'm going to go back to you, Ambassador Wisner, and ask you the oil question. And frankly, a question I have is whether both the collapse in oil prices as well as the pandemic open up some new space for conflict resolution in the region. And then one of our attendees wants to have your personal opinion about the assassination of the leader of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, and whether that was wise and what the impact of that has been and is likely to be.
Yes, let me answer both questions with short introduction. No, we're looking at a government in Tehran that's tough, smart, brutal, calculating. I have no question about that. And Dr. Roxane, I doubt you would doubt it either. When they went into the JCPOA, they went in with their eyes open. There was a balance of risk they were prepared to take and run. And that is to attract capital, technology, market access to the world. They needed that to give long-term stability to Iran, prospects for its young people. They took that risk. They take that risk again for their own interests, not as a favor to us, but from their own interests, but only, and Roxane's got her finger on it, only if there's a basis of trust. And here we have to look at who we'll be dealing with. The people who will be on the other side of the table in the next round, hopefully there will be one, will not be those we saw the last time. It's much more likely to be not even necessarily a clerical face, but much more representative of the IRGC and the harder line in Iran. We're up against a significant set of difficulties. Now, to my mind, the oil price will have devastating effects. It's had in Iran, but Iran is, Roxane, you quite ably pointed out, has reduced its dependence on oil as the primary fuel of its national budget. It's actually much less dependent on oil than our own closer friends in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other side of the Gulf. So actually, who's going to be weakened with the oil price? I am going to argue with some irony, it's less Iran and more our side, not to mention the domestic consequences. So I'm not sure that in a relative balance, the oil price current state of the oil markets is going to be a killer in the Iran situation, much more dangerous for many other reasons to those outside it.
And on Soleimani.
On Soleimani, sorry, of course. Well, I think it was a dreadful decision, to put it bluntly. There are no reasons to believe that Soleimani was the kind of friend you want to take home for dinner. He was a very, very tough, smart, brutal, and there was a lot of American blood on his hands. No question in my mind. But frankly, I take a long view. You don't kill other people's leaders if you accept the fact that one day you're going to have to do business with them. That assassination is a perfectly dreadful instrument of national authorities. And I think we did something that was profoundly unwise. We will be paying for that in the future and for a long time to come. And it was an unwise decision. Is it the end of the road? Nothing's the end of the road. Iran thinks in terms of a long history of the survival of a people, a nation, of a culture, of millennia. So yes, we'll get beyond this, but I hope we learn a lesson that that kind of tactic has more consequences over time that are negative than any short-term sugar rush at the beginning.
Well, let me thank you. Let me thank the council. I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. It's great to hear your perspectives, and we try to be hopeful. At the Atlantic Council, I have a little program called the Future of the Iran Initiative. We believe that US and Iran are destined at some point to at least have civil relations, if not warm relations. And I really think it's important to discuss these issues now. So thank you to all of those who attended, and look forward to seeing hopefully some of you in person before too many more months of lockdown go on. So everyone stay well, stay safe.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Roxane.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you to the council.